The station hung
Warriors of
between
the Realm,
stars
hear
like a lantern
command!
left burning by
We
someone
march
who had
to
forgotten
claim
to
our
come
destiny!
home. Keth Prime
Warriors
was not
of the
beautiful.
Realm,
It
hear
had never tried to
command!
be.
We
It was
march to
functional the
claim
way
our
a clenched
destiny!
fist is functional, built for one purpose, shaped by that purpose, indifferent to everything else. 17 docking rings spiraled outward from its central hub, each one large enough to swallow a city block whole. Ships came and went in an endless procession, cargo haulers, diplomatic cruisers, military escorts, and vessels with no markings at all that everyone pretended not to notice. The station smelled of recycled air and stressed metal and the particular tension that lives in places where power changes hands regularly. Today, power was changing hands in the grand auction hall. Princess Cal Vordane sat in the private viewing box reserved for Valerie royalty and watched the proceedings below with the expression of someone enduring a long and unnecessary meeting. The box was elevated, shielded by a transparent barrier that kept the crowd noise to a manageable murmur. Her seat was upholstered in deep indigo. Her attendant stood at precise intervals behind her. Everything was exactly as protocol demanded. She was bored in a way that had become its own kind of exhaustion. Kale was 28 years old, third in the line of succession to the Valori throne, and she had attended the tribute auction every cycle since she was old enough to be presented at court functions. She knew what it was. The Empire called it an honor, conquered species sending their finest warriors to serve the nobility as bodyguards. Stripped of ceremony and language, it was a reminder. A demonstration of hierarchy made flesh and placed on a stage for bidding. The conquered came here to show they understood their place. The conquerors came to confirm it. Kale had stopped finding this inspiring approximately 4 cycles ago. Below, the auction floor was alive with the energy of an event that considered itself important. Beings from across the empire filled the tiered seating, ambassadors in formal robes, military commanders with chests full of decorations, merchants who had purchased enough legitimacy to sit among the powerful. The announcer's voice carried easily through the hall, describing each tribute candidate in the practiced cadence of someone who had done this many times and had long since stopped feeling anything about it. From the Veth Dominion, the announcer called out, presenting their 7th-generation battle lineage, the warrior Rakkus. Something enormous walked onto the stage. The Veth warrior stood nearly 3 meters tall, covered in natural armor that had grown from its own body over decades of combat conditioning. Its claws were retracted but visible, each one the length of a short sword. When it spread its arms for the crowd, the sound it produced landed somewhere between a roar and a subsonic vibration that Kale felt in her chest from 40 meters away. The crowd responded, bidding paddles rose. Numbers climbed. Kale watched without expression. Her advisor, Elder Rowan, leaned in from his position just behind her left shoulder. He was a man shaped by decades of watching powerful people make catastrophic decisions. Careful, patient, possessed of the specific wisdom that comes from surviving in proximity to ambition for a very long time. He wore his gray scholar's robes with the quiet dignity of someone who had never needed to prove anything to anyone. The Veth warrior has an exceptional record, he said quietly. 17 confirmed eliminations in live combat scenarios. Excellent reflexes. Genetic conditioning from birth. Kale said nothing. She was watching the warrior on the stage, but she was thinking about her predecessor. The one before him, and the one before that. 3 bodyguards in 4 cycles. 3 deaths. Different methods, different perpetrators, but the same essential architecture. Someone in the empire who wanted the 3rd princess removed from the succession, and a willingness to spend whatever was necessary to accomplish it. The first had been poisoned at a state dinner. The second killed by a sniper during a garden ceremony. The third had died stopping a bomb meant for Kale herself, and in doing so had earned a kind of honor that she found she could not look at directly without something in her chest going sharp and wrong. She was not sentimental. She had not been permitted to be sentimental since she was old enough to understand what her position meant. But she was honest, at least with herself, and the honest truth was that she was running out of willingness to watch things die on her behalf. I have had Veth guards before, she said. Yes, princess. They are very impressive on a stage. Rowan was quiet for a moment. They are also very effective in combat, as the records indicate. The records indicated the same about Theros. She kept her voice level. He was the most decorated Silixian blade warrior of his generation. He stopped an explosion that would have killed 17 people, including me. He died because someone slipped a contact poison into the grip of his own weapon while he slept. She paused. Impressive records do not account for the patience of people who are willing to find the gaps. Rowan did not argue. He understood her well enough to know when she was not asking for reassurance. The bidding for the Veth warrior concluded. Another tribute followed, then another. The parade continued. Giants and armored things and creatures whose biology had been shaped over generations toward the single purpose of violence. Kale watched each one with the careful attention of someone cataloging options and finding none quite right, though she could not have said precisely what she was looking for. Then the announcer said something that caused a ripple of reaction through the crowd. From the recently contacted world of Earth, he said, presenting their tribute candidate, the human Garrett Harlow. The ripple became a murmur. The murmur became laughter. Kale leaned forward. She knew what humans were, technically. Earth had been contacted 2 cycles ago, a small planet orbiting an unremarkable star in a quiet section of the galaxy. Humanoid species, bipedal, biologically fragile by galactic standards. No natural armor, no enhanced musculature, no venom or claws or any of the modifications that made other species competitive in a universe that had never rewarded gentleness. The Empire had extended the auction invitation largely as a diplomatic courtesy, the kind offered to species too new to matter but too potentially useful to dismiss. Everyone expected a demonstration of how much humans still had to learn. A single figure walked onto the stage. He was smaller than Kale had expected. Not dramatically. He stood perhaps 2 meters tall, which was unremarkable, but in the context of what had come before him, in a hall accustomed to creatures that ducked through standard doorways, he looked slight. He had dark hair cut close to his skull and skin the color of good earth after rain. He wore simple gray clothing with no ornamentation, nothing that marked him as anything in particular. He carried no visible weapons. He did not spread his arms for the crowd. He did not vocalize or display or perform any of the rituals the other candidates had used to demonstrate worth. He walked to the center of the stage, clasped his hands behind his back, and stopped. The laughter from the crowd grew louder. Someone near the back called out something the translation filters rendered as an inquiry about whether this was some kind of joke. The announcer continued reading the formal description in the same professional tone he had used for every previous candidate, though Kale thought she detected a faint note of discomfort in his delivery. She was not laughing. She was watching the man on the stage with the specific focus she reserved for things that did not quite make sense. There was something wrong about the scene. Not wrong in a way she could immediately name. Wrong the way a perfectly ordinary-looking lock sometimes turns out to be more complicated than its exterior suggests. Garrett Harlow was not performing. He was not doing nothing either. His eyes moved through the crowd in a slow, methodical sweep. Not the nervous scanning of someone overwhelmed by an unfamiliar environment, but the deliberate observation of someone conducting an assessment. He looked at the exits. He looked at the elevated positions. He looked at the other tribute candidates in the staging area. His gaze moved the way water finds its path through complex terrain, following the contours of the space, noting every relevant feature, recording everything without apparent effort. He looked at nothing with surprise. He looked at everything as if he had already expected it to be exactly what it was. "What is his name?" Kale asked. She already knew the announcer had said it, but she wanted to hear it again. "Garrett Harlow," Rowan said, consulting his datapad, 34 years of age by Earth's calendar. His record list service was something called the Special Operations Division, which appears to be a specialized military unit operating out of Fort Bragg. Beyond that, the humans have declined to provide further information. Well, their official position is that detailed military records are protected information. The unofficial interpretation, according to the diplomatic liaison, is that humans are somewhat protective about the specifics of what their military does and why. Kale looked at the man on the stage. He had not moved. The crowd was still laughing. Something in her that had been very tired for a very long time became, suddenly and unexpectedly, curious. "I will take him," she said. Rowan was quiet for precisely 3 seconds. Kale counted them. "Princess," he said carefully, "the Veth warrior alone would offer significantly greater." "I am aware of the Veth warrior's record, Rowan. The human has no documented modifications, no visible equipment, no combat history the Empire can verify." I know. He is smaller than the average Silixian courier. I know that as well. Another pause. May I ask what specifically has caught your interest? Cale watched Garrett Harlow stand motionless on the stage while the crowd laughed at him. He did not react to the laughter. He did not stiffen with pride or flush with embarrassment or shift his weight with discomfort. He absorbed the room's contempt the way good stone absorbs rain, completely, without visible effect, and with no indication that it had caused any change whatsoever. He is watching the exits, she said. He identified all four in the first 30 seconds and has been noting which ones have guard positions and which do not. He has looked at every elevated position in this hall. He has assessed every tribute candidate in the staging area, not for threat level, but for tactical utility. She paused. He walked into a room full of beings that could kill him without effort, and his first instinct was to figure out how the room worked. Rowan was quiet for a longer moment. Make the purchase, Chase, she said. The bidding lasted approximately 40 seconds. No one else entered. Cale's banner appeared over Garrett Harlow's image for the minimum possible price. Less, as she would reflect later, than a decent meal at the palace. The crowd found this genuinely hilarious. She met him in the collection area on the station's lower level, where new acquisitions were formally transferred to their owners. It was a bare space, plain walls, efficient lighting, the hum of recycled air. Harlow stood waiting when she arrived with her retinue, exactly where he was supposed to stand, in exactly the posture protocol required. Up close, he was different from what the stage had suggested. Not different in the ways she had been warned about. He was not secretly larger or secretly modified or possessed of some visible quality that explained why Earth had considered him worth sending. The difference was subtler. The scars on his hands, for instance, old ones distributed in patterns that suggested not a single dramatic event, but a long accumulation of incidents, each one healed and integrated and forgotten. The economy of how he held himself, which was not the economy of someone conserving energy, but of someone for whom stillness was simply the natural state, and his eyes, dark, level, with a depth that reminded Cale of very old water. He looked tired, not dramatically, not the visible exhaustion of recent sleep deprivation. It was a deeper tiredness, the kind that accumulates over years of doing things that cannot be undone, settling into a person's face so gradually they stop noticing it themselves. So, Cale said, you are my new bodyguard. Yes, princess. His voice was quiet, not soft, and there was a distinction, and she noted it immediately. Soft voices suggested yielding. His voice simply did not require volume to carry weight. Do you know what happened to my previous bodyguards? I was briefed. 3 deaths in 4 cycles, different methods. They were very accomplished, all of them. I understand. You won't last a month. She said it plainly, without cruelty. It was information. There are a great many people in this empire who want me removed from the succession, and they will not stop because of you. They will study you the way they study the others. They will find your gaps. They will be patient about it. Harlow looked at her. Something moved through his eyes, something old, something that had been sitting behind whatever he normally showed the world, visible for just a moment before it was gone again. I understand, princess, he said. Do you? You're warning me because you'd rather I know the truth than believe comfortable things about this assignment. She looked at him. Yes? Then yes, I understand. The 6 guards of her standing retinue surrounded them in a loose perimeter, all larger than Harlow, all more visibly equipped, all regarding him with the particular blend of amusement and dismissal that comes naturally to beings who have never had cause to feel outclassed. One of them, a 4-armed droxy named Corvon, who had the physical dimensions of a small vehicle, was struggling to contain something that kept threatening to become a grin. The little human thinks he's a bodyguard, Corvin said to no one in particular. Then he reached out and slapped Harlow on the shoulder. It was not a friendly gesture. Corvan had the body mass that makes even casual contact a structural event. The force he applied would have sent a normal being stumbling sideways, scrambling for balance, making the involuntary sounds of something caught off guard by physics. Harlow did not move. Not a stumble, not a shift, not a single adjustment of weight or posture. He remained exactly where he had been, as if the impact had passed through him rather than into him. as if his body had taken the force and translated it somewhere else entirely, not through resistance, but through some arrangement of structure and orientation that distributed it before it could have its intended effect. Corvan blinked. The other guards went very still. Harlow looked up at the Droxy who towered over him. His expression had not changed. His voice when he spoke was the same quiet, level tone as before. "I didn't say I was tough," he said. "I said I understood the assignment." Corvan took a half step back. He did not seem aware that he had done it. Kale filed this away carefully. She had seen many demonstrations of strength in her years attending tribute auctions and reviewing military candidates. She knew what strength looked like, the performance of it, the theater, the way it was displayed for maximum effect. What she had just witnessed was not strength. It was something that went several layers deeper, into territory where the vocabulary of normal combat assessments stopped being useful. She turned and walked toward the exit. "Come," she said. "We return to the palace. Try not to die before we arrive. I would hate to waste even the minimum I paid for you." She did not look back. She heard his footsteps fall into position exactly 3 paces behind her, the precise regulation distance for a formal bodyguard escort, and she noted, because she noticed everything, that she had not told him what that distance was supposed to be. The Valori Palace occupied the highest levels of the Empire's primary world, Vorthus Prime, a planet of ancient stone and engineered atmosphere and architecture built and rebuilt across so many generations that it had become something like geology. The upper levels, where royalty resided, were made of materials that had been grown rather than constructed. Crystalline formations encouraged over centuries into shapes that combined structural utility with beauty so precise it occasionally felt threatening. Kale's private wing was in the 3rd tower. She had lived there for 11 years. She knew every hallway, every room, every corner and alcove and sightline. Not out of aesthetic appreciation, but out of the practical understanding that knowing your environment better than the people trying to kill you is one of the more reliable survival advantages available. In the first 2 weeks after Harlow arrived, she watched him learn it faster than she had. He said almost nothing. He followed her everywhere, 3 paces back, and he watched. Not dramatically. He did not crane his neck or make obvious assessments or announce his observations. He moved through the spaces and received them, the way a particular kind of attention receives information, without apparent effort and without apparent limit. On the 3rd day, he pointed out that the corridor leading to the secondary dining room had a sightline problem from the eastern window. A position on the exterior garden wall provided a clean angle that the security sweep pattern missed. He mentioned it once, quietly, to the head of her standing guard unit. He did not repeat it or follow up. On the 6th day, he noted that one of the service staff who delivered morning tea had begun taking a slightly different route to her chambers. He observed this on 2 consecutive mornings before mentioning it to Kale directly, in the same tone he might use to mention a change in weather. The staff member, when checked, turned out to have been approached 3 days earlier by an Oyanin with connections to her brother Davin's network. The approach had been refused, but it indicated a probe in progress. The standing guard unit, which had initially regarded Harlow with the contemptuous amusement of professionals confronted with something decorative, began to treat him differently after the 6th day. Not warmly, the warmth never fully developed, but with a careful, watchful attention, the way experienced soldiers look at terrain that has surprised them before. Predators notably simply avoided him. The palace kept several creatures that fell under the category of trained security animals. Large, modified things whose biology had been specifically shaped toward threat detection and response. They were, by any reasonable metric, dangerous. They had never, in Kale's experience, demonstrated reluctance about anything. They would not go near Harlow. Not obviously, not with visible panic. They moved to the edges of whatever space he occupied, pressed against walls or handlers, and directed their attention anywhere but toward him. It was not the behavior of animals responding to a threat they understood. It was the behavior of animals responding to a category of thing their instincts had no file for. Something that did not fit the established pattern of predator or prey. Something that activated responses they did not have names for. Elder Rowan found this deeply interesting. "There is a concept in human psychology," he told Kale one evening, after 3 days of private research. "They call it pattern recognition at the instinctive level. The idea that some kinds of danger are recognized not through learned experience, but through something older, something in the deep architecture of a nervous system that developed in an environment where certain threats had to be identified before there was time to think about them consciously. Kale was at the window of her study, looking out over the palace city. You think the animals are responding to something they cannot consciously identify. I think something in their instinctive architecture is identifying him as a predator. Not a predator like a Veth warrior or a Silixian hunting beast. Those are categories they have files for. Something older. Something that does not fit the established patterns. Rowan paused. They look at him, and something in them says, this thing can end me, and there is nothing in my available responses that applies. You find that concerning. I find it, Rowan said, instructive. The diplomatic dinner was held on the 21st day. The Crystal Hall at full formal arrangement was one of the more genuinely remarkable spaces Kale had encountered in a life that had included remarkable spaces. The walls were living gemstone, formations that had been growing for several hundred years and had reached a complexity where light moved through them in ways that felt less like refraction and more like communication. 1,000 points of illumination shifted and merged and separated as the room breathed with the movement of its occupants. The tables stretched the length of the floor, covered in arrangements that had required a week of preparation. Food from across the empire filled plates of hammered gold. Wine older than some of the civilizations represented moved in slow procession through the crowd. Kale sat at her assigned table, placed with customary precision at the far end of the hall from the emperor's seat of honor. She had been assigned this table since she was old enough to attend formal dinners. The positioning was deliberate, a spatial reminder of succession order, of who mattered and who was tolerated. She had stopped resenting it some years ago and had started simply noting it as useful information about how her siblings thought about her. Harlow stood behind her chair. She had grown without intending to, familiar with how a space felt when he occupied it. Not louder or more crowded, but more precisely defined, as if the room's geometry had been quietly clarified. She sometimes noticed when he was not in her immediate vicinity and experienced a faint, irritating sense of incompleteness, which she attributed to the reasonable practical value of having a functional bodyguard and did not examine further. The dinner progressed. Speeches were made in the formal register of imperial occasions. Deals were whispered with diplomatic indirection. Politics moved through the room like weather, invisible until it had already arrived, then impossible to ignore. The lights went out. The transition was not gradual. It was total. The kind of darkness that had been engineered, that occupied the room with the completeness of a prepared event. In the half-second before her eyes could begin adjusting, Kale heard the crowd shifting from confusion to alarm, the specific pitch of beings who had been comfortable and were suddenly not. She felt Harlow's hand on her shoulder before she had consciously registered that she should move. The pressure was precise and utterly certain. Not aggressive, not rough, just exactly the amount of force required to communicate a single clear instruction. Down, now below the table. She went. She was already moving before the thinking part of her mind had formed the thought. She heard the crash of breaking glass. She heard the high building hum of energy weapons powering up. She heard someone, somewhere in the room, scream, a sound cut off with horrible abruptness. The emergency lighting engaged. Red. Everything became the color of old blood. 3 figures stood in the center of the floor. They wore black armor that absorbed the emergency light rather than reflecting it, the kind of material not available through normal commerce channels, that could only be acquired by people with both the money and the connections to access things that officially did not exist. In their hands, they held curved blades glowing at their edges with the pale luminescence of poison-treated metals. The blades moved in slow, circular patterns, the unconscious warm-up of hands that had been doing this for so long it had become as natural as breathing. Keith Ronnie blade dancers. Even filtered through the blurring effect of emergency lighting, there was no mistaking what they were. The fluid, boneless way they moved, the signature of decades of specific conditioning, was as clear as a name. They were the most expensive assassins in the Empire. People hired blade dancers when they needed absolute certainty. Her guards moved to intercept. Corvan went first, all 4 arms engaged, driving forward with the momentum of something that had never in its life been stopped by direct confrontation. He met the nearest dancer and lasted approximately 3 seconds. The blade found every gap in his engagement as if mapped in advance. He fell, and he did not get up, and Kyle filed away the fact of his death with the cold efficiency of someone who cannot afford to stop and grieve in the middle of a situation that is still unfolding. The Silixian guard, whose natural armor had stopped things that would have ended less durable beings, managed a single block strike before two more blades found the specific junction points that natural armor never quite covered. He folded. The third guard, a Veth warrior on loan from Kale's secondary protection unit, decorated, experienced, blocked one blow, redirected a second, and made a small error of judgment about the third dancer's follow-through angle. He did not make a second error. The three dancers stepped over the bodies and turned toward Kale's table. She was behind it, pressed to the floor, watching through the legs of overturned chairs with the clarity of someone whose perception had been sharpened to extraordinary precision by the understanding that death was now a practical, rather than abstract concern. Then Harlow stepped forward. He came out from behind the table without rushing. He did not announce himself or assume a stance or do any of the things that fighters do when preparing to fight. He walked toward the three blade dancers the way a man walks toward something he needs to take care of, with the relaxed purposefulness of someone who has a clear task and intends to complete it without unnecessary drama. The crowd, those who had not fled, went completely silent. The first dancer struck. The blade moved in an arc that seemed to bypass the segment of time between beginning and end, arriving at its destination with an efficiency that made the air around it flinch. It hit nothing. Harlow was not where the blade arrived. He had not leaped or rolled or performed any of the dramatic evasions that characterized the combat styles she had seen demonstrated at military reviews. He had simply, as if by a quiet act of geometry, not been in the specific location the blade needed him to occupy. His hand came up and found the dancer's elbow at exactly the point where the arm's architecture became a disadvantage. He applied a small amount of force in a very specific direction. The arm broke. The sound was clear and definitive in the sudden quiet of the hall. Before the dancer could produce any response to what had happened, Harlow's other hand completed a movement that Kale's eyes registered, but her mind refused to fully assemble into its component parts. The dancer fell. The sound Kale had been waiting for never came. 2 seconds. She counted them afterward, replaying the sequence in her memory with obsessive precision. The other two dancers attacked together. They had been trained for exactly this contingency, the response protocol for situations where a target has unexpected protection. They came from both sides, coordinating without signal, blades moving in patterns designed to make any single evasion insufficient. Harlow dropped to one knee. Both blades passed over his head with the sound of something that has missed its purpose. His hands shot out, one to each dancer, and found their ankles. He pulled. They fell. What happened in the following moments was something that Kale witnessed and could not subsequently describe with accuracy because it occurred faster than the descriptive faculty of memory could process. She saw movement. She heard impacts. She saw bodies oriented in configurations that were not the configurations they had arrived in. Then it was over. 3 Keith Ronnie blade dancers lay on the floor of the Crystal Hall. 3 of the finest assassins in the known empire, each one the product of decades of specific conditioning and chemical enhancement and neural modification. They lay in the particular stillness of things that were no longer engaged in the process of being. Harlow stood among them. He was breathing. There was no blood on him. His clothes showed no evidence of contact with anything that had happened. He looked, as far as Kale could determine from her position behind an overturned table, exactly as he had looked before the lights went out. He looked down at the bodies for a moment. Then he looked across the wreckage of the hall to where she was. "You should leave, Princess," he said. "More may come." Later, in the silence of her private chambers with the door sealed and Rowan standing guard outside and the palace security running sweeps on every level, she sat across from him in 2 chairs that faced each other and said, "What are you?" He looked at his hands for a long moment. When he looked up, there was something in his expression she had not seen before. Not openness exactly, but a willingness to allow the question to be answered. "Human," he said. "That is not what I meant." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "My species evolved on a planet that spent several million years trying to kill us. Every environment was dangerous. Every predator was faster or stronger or better armored. We had nothing, no claws, no venom, no natural defenses, nothing a reasonable evolutionary process would design as competitive. And yet, and yet, he turned his hands over looking at the scarred knuckles, the patterns of old damage distributed across old healing. We learned to hunt differently, not faster than our prey, not stronger. We followed things until they died from exhaustion. Days, sometimes. We could regulate our temperature while they could not. We could recover while they could not. We simply never stopped. Kale said nothing. She was listening with the specific attention she reserved for things that were telling her something important. Over time, we became something else, Harlow continued. We studied what killed us and made it into science. We developed weapons that could end everything. We fought wars so terrible that we had to create rules to limit ourselves, because without limits, we would have destroyed everything we were trying to protect. Every generation, we understood death better. We got more precise about it. And you, she said, what are you specifically? He met her eyes. I am what remains when you remove everything except the understanding of how things end. No anger, no fear, no performance. Just knowledge and the decision about whether to use it. She held his gaze. Earth sent you as a message. He did not confirm or deny this. He simply looked at her and allowed the silence to mean what it meant. Get some sleep, he said finally. Tomorrow will require you to be clear-headed. He stood, moved to the door, and took his position outside it. Kale sat alone in the room for a long time. She thought about what she had purchased at the auction on Keth Prime. She thought about minimum bids and the laughter of a crowd and a man who had absorbed a Droxy's full-force impact without shifting his weight. She thought about what Rowan had found in the records. The single line from a Fort Bragg commanding officer, written in the spare bureaucratic language of military documentation. Volunteer assignments only. Do not order. He had chosen to be here. The question of why settled into her mind and stayed there, patient and insistent, like something waiting to be understood. Down the corridor, Garrett Harlow stood at his post in the dark and watched the palace breathe around him, measuring each sound against what it should be, finding nothing that required immediate attention, and remaining exactly where he was. The first attempt came 9 days after the Crystal Hall. It was poison, which was traditional. The method had a long history in imperial politics, longer than most of the civilizations currently represented at court, long enough to have developed its own grammar, its own set of established conventions and counter-conventions. A slow evolutionary arms race between those who administered it and those who tried to survive it. The particular compound used on the 9th day was sophisticated enough to leave no trace in standard detection sweeps, developed specifically for Valori physiology, and the person who commissioned it had paid a substantial sum for the confidence that it would work. It did not work because Garrett Harlow did not eat from plates he had not watched being prepared, and he had extended this practice, without announcement or explanation, to every plate set before Kale as well. The server who carried the compound into Kale's breakfast chamber did not know, when he lifted the cover from the first dish, that the human bodyguard standing 3 meters away had already identified the faint, layered chemical signature by scent. Something not quite right about the air above the plate that most beings would not register as anything other than a vague, nameless discomfort. Harlow said, "Don't eat that." 2 words, no alarm, no drama. The same tone he used to note a sightline problem in a corridor. The server was detained. The compound was confirmed. The chain of commission was followed backward through 4 intermediary contacts before it disappeared into the kind of administrative shadow that powerful people keep specifically for this purpose. Davin's network, almost certainly, though almost certainly was not provably, and provable was the only currency that mattered in imperial succession disputes. Kale ate a different breakfast and noted that she had been saved, for the second time, by a man whose primary visible quality remained an almost inhuman stillness. The second attempt was a sniper positioned on an exterior maintenance platform 300 meters from her balcony window, a location outside the standard security perimeter, accessible through a service route that had not been flagged as a vulnerability. Harlow spotted him during a morning observation of the grounds and reported it to Palace Security before the shooter had taken his first sight alignment. The sniper was detained. He carried documentation connecting him to a procurement network that Kale's security division had been trying to trace for 2 years. This was, in its terrible way, useful. The third attempt was two more blade dancers. They died faster than the first three. Harlow did not appear winded afterward. Kale found this simultaneously reassuring and deeply unsettling. The fourth involved a creature that had been specifically bred over several generations of careful genetic manipulation to respond to Valori pheromone signatures as a predator stimulus. It had been introduced into the palace's service infrastructure through a contractor with legitimate access, positioned to intercept Kale during a morning walk through the lower garden levels. Harlow killed it with his hands, efficiently, and then stood over it for a long moment examining its design with the expression of someone encountering a technical solution to a familiar problem and mentally filing away the approach. Someone invested significant resources in that, Kale said. The breeding program alone would have taken 15 to 20 years. That suggests someone who has been planning this for a long time. It suggests someone who planned for the possibility of you surviving long enough to require it. He looked at her. Different thing. She thought about that for the rest of the day. The fifth attempt was poison gas, introduced through a modified air filtration unit in her private office. The sixth was an energy weapon concealed inside a diplomatic gift package, a trigger mechanism so small that standard scanning protocols missed it entirely. Harlow did not miss it. He removed the package from Kale's hands before she had finished reading the accompanying note, and he was correct. And later she sat in her study and looked at her own hands for a while and thought about what her life had become. The seventh was an explosive device carried inside the body of a kitchen servant, a method so extreme, so irreversible for the carrier, that it communicated something important about the desperation level of whoever was commissioning these operations. The servant walked into Kale's morning meeting, smiled in the way that people smile when they are not thinking about the smile, and began to move toward the center of the room. Harlow crossed the space between them in less time than Kale could account for. His hand closed around the servant's wrist. There was a sound. The detonator fell from fingers that could no longer hold it. The man himself was dead before his body reached the floor, though Kale, afterward, could not reconstruct exactly what had happened in the interval between Harlow moving and the man falling. "How did you know?" she asked. She had asked variations of this question before, but this time the answer mattered in a different way. His pulse was wrong. His breathing was wrong. Harlow looked at the body on the floor with the dispassionate attention of a doctor reviewing a case. He smelled of fear and something chemical underneath it, and he looked at me too long when he entered. A pause. People who plan to die in an explosion do not care about bodyguards. He should not have been afraid of me unless he knew what I was capable of. That fear told me what he was here to do. After the seventh attempt, the attempt stopped. Not because the threat had been resolved, not because Kale's enemies had reconsidered their objectives. The attempt stopped because contractors were no longer available. Word had moved through the specific networks where people of this profession communicated with each other. Not publicly, not loudly, but with the efficiency of information that an entire community needs to know. 7 attempts, 7 complete failures, the human bodyguard. The quiet one who did not look like what he was. The details that had emerged about how those failures had concluded. Kale understood this when Rowan explained it to her one evening in her study, sitting across the desk from her, his gray scholar's robes slightly rumpled in the way they always were by the end of a long day, his expression carrying the weight of someone who had assembled information he found more interesting than comfortable. "They are not afraid of you," he said carefully. "They are afraid of what stands next to you." She was quiet for a moment. "Good. Perhaps." He folded his hands. Fear is a useful deterrent. It is also an imprecise one. Fear of the cost of an action and assessment of whether the action is necessary are different calculations. If your siblings conclude that the cost of eliminating you remains lower than the cost of allowing you to survive, then they will find a way to modify the cost. She nodded. "I know." She turned to look out the window at the palace city below. Millions of lights in the dark, each one a life unaware of the calculations being made in the rooms above them. She thought about Corvan, who had died in the Crystal Hall without hesitation, forearms swinging, throwing himself at things that were going to kill him. She had not spoken his name aloud since the night of his death. She spoke it now, quietly, to no one in particular. Rowan heard it. He bowed his head for a moment. He was very brave, he said. He was, Cale agreed. Make sure his family is provided for. From my personal accounts, not the household budget, no one should be able to trace it back to an official line item. It will be done. She nodded and returned to the window. Rowan, has Harlow been conducting meetings? Rowan's expression shifted in a way that told her he had been waiting for this question. I have become aware of several instances in which he has engaged in private conversation with individuals outside the household staff. Primarily, nobles, Cale said. Yes, representatives of several of the neutral houses, families that have maintained formal independence from both Davin's military coalition and Seven's network of noble loyalties. The meetings appear to have occurred during the periods when you have been in formal sessions or private quarters, times when his immediate presence was not strictly required. And he did not report these meetings to you or to me. No. How long has this been occurring? I estimate, Rowan said, with the careful precision of a man who had been reconstructing a timeline, since approximately the second week of his assignment. Cale was quiet for a long time. Then she stood up and walked out of the study. She found him in the corridor outside her chambers, where he stood at the end of each day's duties with the focused repose of something that did not require activity to remain fully present. You have been meeting with members of the neutral houses, she said. Yes, without informing me. Yes, without informing Rowan. Yes. She studied his face. He looked back at her with the same level, unhurried attention he brought to everything. No defensiveness, no guilt, no performance of either explanation or apology. I would like to know, she said. Why? He held her gaze for a moment. Then he reached into the interior of his jacket and produced a small, flat object. A notebook. Physical. Paper. The kind that could not be remotely accessed or digitally intercepted, that existed only in the space it physically occupied, that could only be read by someone holding it. He opened it and turned it toward her. It took her a moment to understand what she was seeing. The page was covered in a dense, precise mapping, not of geography but of relationships. Names connected by lines annotated with single words or short phrases. Nodes with multiple connections highlighted differently from nodes with few. Clusters that clearly represented factions or aligned interests and the channels between them, and the specific points where the channels were narrow enough to be controlled. She recognized names, not all of them, but enough to understand what the structure represented, the entire political architecture of the empire, not the official architecture, not the formal structure of titles and appointments that appeared in court documentation. The real one, the one underneath, made of debts and loyalties and fears, and the specific calculations that beings with power make about where their interests lie. The neutral houses were mapped here, each one annotated with key information. What they wanted, what they feared losing, who they owed and who owed them, which relationships were strong and which were transactional, and which were one bad season away from shifting entirely. She turned another page. Another. The mapping continued, growing more detailed in some areas and more speculative in others, but always clearly distinguishing between what was confirmed and what was assessed. He had marked his sources, not by name but by reliability weighting. He had been building this since the second week. You were not gathering information for yourself, she said. No. You were mapping the landscape I would need to navigate if I survived long enough to need to navigate it. Someone had to, he said. You were busy surviving. She looked at him. The anger she had carried into the corridor, the cold kind that comes from feeling managed, from feeling that information has been withheld, from feeling that something is happening in your own life that you were not made party to, began to undergo a transformation in the chemistry of her understanding. You built me a map, she said, the beginnings of one, without being asked. You would have gotten around to asking, but the people you would have tasked with building it would have had limitations I don't have. What limitations? He looked at her steadily. They would have expected the interesting information to be in places where interesting information is usually kept. She turned the notebook over in her hands, felt the weight of it, the patience that it represented, weeks of specific, careful observation and conversation, and cross-referencing, conducted in the margins of a security assignment, structured toward a purpose that had nothing to do with keeping her alive in the immediate physical sense, and everything to do with keeping her alive in the sense that mattered over longer timescales. "You are not just protecting my body," she said. "No. You are making sure that if I survive, I have something to survive into." Well, he said nothing. He did not need to. "I want full access to everything in this," she said. "It's yours. And I want you to brief me. Every piece of it." "I know." She looked at him one more time, then she walked back into her study, sat down across from Rowan and said, "Clear my schedule for tomorrow morning. Harlow will be explaining some things." The briefings took 3 days. Harlow sat across from her at the study desk each morning for 4 hours and moved through the notebook's contents with the methodical precision of someone who had organized information for transmission and knew exactly what order made sense for the recipient. He did not editorialize beyond what the data supported. He presented what he had and distinguished clearly between what was confirmed and what was inferred and what was extrapolated, and he allowed her to draw her own conclusions and only redirected when her conclusions outran the available evidence. By the end of the third day, Cale understood the political landscape of the empire in a way that no amount of formal education in the mechanisms of court had ever produced. The formal education had taught her the structure. This taught her the physics, the actual forces that move things, the actual pressure points, the actual gaps where an application of the right leverage at the right moment could shift weight in ways the official architecture had never anticipated. On the fourth day after the briefings, she asked Rowan to arrange a meeting with House Cauldron. The Cauldron family occupied a position in the empire's political middle ground that was, as Harlow had mapped it, more interesting than their formal neutrality suggested. Old money in the truest sense, wealth accumulated not through military conquest or political appointment, but through the patient development of trade relationships across 3 generations, which meant they had connections to virtually every significant faction and owed formal loyalty to none of them. Their neutrality was not ideological. It was a strategic asset, carefully maintained, and they would trade it for something of sufficient value if the right offer were presented at the right moment. The meeting took place in one of the palace's formal reception suites, a neutral space chosen because it had no strong territorial association with any of the major factions. The head of House Cauldron, a woman named Threnia Cauldron, was in her 60s by Valori reckoning and carried herself with the unhurried assurance of someone who had spent that time primarily engaged in understanding how things worked. She was polite. She was precise. She was watching Cale with the assessment of a trader, evaluating something that might be valuable or might be counterfeit, and she had not yet decided which. Harlow stood behind Cale's chair and said nothing. The meeting proceeded through the formal, preliminary phases, the ritual exchanges that established the context of the conversation without yet establishing its content, the careful verbal sparring that served as mutual evaluation. Cale had been trained for this. She knew the protocol. She executed it with reasonable competence, and she could feel, even as she was doing it, the specific way Threnia Cauldron's attention measured her against whatever standard was being applied. Then she made an error. It was a small error by one reading, a phrase that carried a different implication than she had intended. A slight misalignment between the formal register and the content that suggested she was treating Cauldron's neutrality as something already moving toward her, rather than something still to be earned. In the specific grammar of this kind of negotiation, it was the equivalent of assuming a transaction was complete before the terms had been agreed. Threnia Cauldron's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes shifted, a minor recalibration, clearly visible to anyone watching closely enough. Cale felt the meeting tilt. She did not look at Harlow. She could feel the specific texture of his stillness behind her, unchanged, unhelpful, deliberately absent from the moment in a way that communicated clearly. This is yours to resolve or not. She thought about the notebook. She thought about what she knew, not what she had been taught about the Cauldron family, but what Harlow's mapping had revealed about what they actually needed, what they feared losing, what they had been moving toward, in the careful way that families who have survived 3 generations of empire politics move toward anything. She took a breath and changed direction entirely. "There is no formal mechanism," she said. Within the current imperial structure, for the kind of commercial representation that your family's scope would warrant. That is a gap. Gaps in structure have historically been filled by whoever identified them first and understood their function. Threnia Cauldron was quiet, watching. What I am proposing is not a concession. It is the acknowledgement of something that should have existed before now, an independent commerce council with representation proportional to trade, volume, and connection reach, rather than military affiliation or noble hierarchy. A permanent seat, structural, not advisory. She let that sit in the silence of the room. The silence lasted approximately 8 seconds. In the grammar of this kind of negotiation, that was a significant interval. That structure, Threnia Cauldron said finally, does not currently exist. No, it would be created. By whom? By whoever sits on the throne when it becomes necessary to have it. Another silence, shorter this time. That is, Threnia Cauldron said, with the measured tone of someone revising an assessment in real time, an interesting formulation. The meeting ended 40 minutes later with the kind of agreement that does not produce documents, the kind that exists in the understanding between two people who have each decided that the other is worth committing to, and who are willing to let that commitment become real when the moment requires it. Walking back through the palace corridors and afterward, Kale was aware of Harlow behind her and aware of the specific silence he was maintaining. Not his ordinary silence, something more deliberate. She waited. He waited longer. Finally, that decision was yours, he said. The pivot, the council, that was not in any briefing material. No. You saw something that wasn't in the map. I saw what she needed that we hadn't accounted for. She paused. There was a gap. Yes, a beat. Remember how that felt? She said nothing, but she filed it away carefully, the way she had filed away everything he had given her that mattered. The emperor fell ill in the 6th month. There was no dramatic announcement. The palace simply developed over 2 weeks a particular hell-breath tension, the kind that spreads through a large institution when something important has changed and no one has yet said it out loud. Servants moved differently. Senior officials held more closed-door meetings. Military commanders who were normally stationed in the outer territories began finding reasons to be present in the capital. Elder Rowan confirmed it on a Tuesday morning. The physicians are describing it as a rare degenerative condition. The court position is that it is manageable, and the emperor will return to full capacity within several months. The actual position? Rowan was quiet for a moment. He has perhaps 3 months, possibly less. Kale sat with this. She had known it was coming, had known in the abstract way that beings who have been paying attention for long enough know that things which have been moving in a particular direction will eventually arrive at their destination. She had not known it would be this fast. Devon in 7, she said. Yes. Rowan nodded. My sources indicate preliminary contact has been made between their respective organizations. The nature of the contact suggests exploratory alliance discussions rather than direct coordination, a temporary alignment against a common priority before returning to competition with each other. I am the common priority. You represent the simplest way to reduce the variables. If you are removed from succession before the emperor dies, the contest is between the two of them, which is a simpler problem with more predictable parameters than a 3-way succession dispute with a third candidate who has been gathering quiet support among the neutral houses. Kale nodded once. Then she looked up and found Harlow, who was standing by the window in his customary position of apparent complete disengagement, and said, "You knew." It was not a question. Harlow held her gaze. Yes. About the alliance. About the preliminary contact. About the direction it was moving. How long? He was quiet for a moment. 2 weeks. Rowan looked at him, then at Kale, then back at Harlow, with the expression of someone recalibrating a series of assumptions simultaneously. You knew 2 weeks ago, Kale said, and you didn't tell me. No. Why not? He moved away from the window and came to stand at the desk, not sitting, just standing, present without claiming the space. Because knowing is not the same as being able to act. If I had told you 2 weeks ago, you would have had information without the context to use it. Rowan would have had information without confirmed sources. We would have been operating on my assessment alone with no external verification. And now? Now Rowan has confirmed it through independent channels. The information has corroboration. The pattern is visible to more than one observer. He paused. Devon and Seven can only be challenged with evidence that cannot be dismissed as the self-interested claims of the party most affected. That requires time and independent confirmation. She looked at him steadily. You used yourself as the primary intelligence source and waited for the independent confirmation to catch up. Yes. During which time you were also presumably the primary target of the preliminary action. Yes. You used yourself as bait. The room went very still. It's just math, Harlow said. The variable with the most information is also the variable that can tolerate the most uncertainty without losing effectiveness. I can operate under incomplete information without it affecting my function. You cannot. Not yet. Not without the architecture you've been building. He paused. If the preliminary move against you was going to come, it was better to come after Rowan had independent confirmation and after House Cauldron was committed. Kale looked at him for a long time. She thought about what it meant to understand something in the abstract and what it meant to understand it specifically. The gap between knowing that a person is strategic and understanding what it feels like to have that strategy operating around you, with you as one of its variables, calibrated toward your survival without your knowledge or consent. She thought about the notebook and the 3 days of briefings. She thought about remember how that felt and what it meant that he had been doing all of this from the beginning. Not because it was his assigned function, but because he had looked at the situation and identified what needed to happen and then done it, quietly, in the margins of everything else. She thought about the single line in his personnel file. Volunteer assignments only. Do not order. They will move soon, she said. Yes. What do we do? He looked at her. We stay where we are. We let them come. Rowan made a small, involuntary sound. If we run, Harlow continued, they control the terrain. If we hide, they control the timeline. If we wait in the right position, they come to us. On ground we've already prepared, at a moment we've already accounted for. Kale turned this over carefully. She thought about everything she had learned in the past 6 months, about power and how it actually moved, about the gaps in structure and how they could be filled, about the difference between the map that was officially true and the map that described reality. She thought about Threnia Cauldron's eyes during those 8 seconds of silence and what it had felt like to identify the gap and step into it without a script. I need to know, she said, that when they come you will still be standing. He held her gaze, and this time there was something different in it, not the quick flicker of something old passing through and being controlled again. Something slower, more deliberate. The face of a man who had considered something and reached a conclusion and was willing to be seen in that conclusion. I will be standing, he said. She held his gaze. Then she nodded once, the kind of nod that commits rather than merely acknowledges. Then we wait, she said. Outside, the palace city burned with its million ordinary lights, all of them going about the business of their lives in the comfortable belief that the architecture of their world was stable. In the office at the top of the tower, 3 people sat with the truth and the stillness that comes from knowing what is coming and having chosen not to run from it. Harlow returned to the window. He stood there in the dark, watching the city below, measuring everything against what it should be. Somewhere in the palace, David and Seven were having their conversations. The math was being done on both sides, and the warden kept his watch. They came on a Thursday. Kale would remember this detail later, the specific ordinariness of the day that preceded it, the way Thursday had always been the quietest day of the imperial week, administratively light, ceremonially minimal. She would remember the morning tea that Harlow cleared before she touched it, not because it was poison, but because the server who brought it had been replaced by someone 3 degrees removed from Davin's household staff, and the substitution had not been authorized. She would remember the particular texture of the palace's silence through the afternoon, not the silence of an ordinary day, but the silence of something that had been cleared away, of spaces from which the usual human noise had been deliberately removed. Harlow had said nothing specific. He had simply moved through the day with an attention that was different from his usual attention. Not more urgent, not more visible, but more complete. As if every sense had been extended to its maximum range, and was transmitting in real time. Kale had matched it. She had moved through her afternoon sessions and her correspondence and her formal obligations with every outward appearance of a Thursday, and beneath that surface she had been as alert as she had ever been in her life, aware of every sound, every shift in quarter traffic, every pattern that departed from the baseline she had spent 6 months learning. The message from Rowan came at the 7th hour of the evening. They have cleared the lower levels. The regular guard rotation has been replaced. Captain Vale's unit is moving into position. She read it once and showed it to Harlow. He read it without visible reaction. He held the message for a moment, then said, "We move now, not later. Now, while they are still positioning and before they have finished closing the geometry." Where? The secondary access corridor on the 3rd sublevel. It connects to the exterior service infrastructure. If Rowan's prepared position is where I told him to prepare it, we have a window of approximately 20 minutes. You planned the route. 3 weeks ago. He looked at her. In the event that staying and fighting was the only option, I needed to control where it happened. She understood then, fully, in a way she had been approaching incrementally for 6 months, that everything he had done had been held simultaneously in his mind from some early point, the immediate action and the contingency and the contingency's contingency, all of it running in parallel beneath the surface of the calm she had initially mistaken for simplicity. "Stay close," he said, "whatever happens. Stay behind me and do not run." She nodded. They moved. The lower levels of the palace were a different architecture than the upper ones, older, built for function rather than impression, corridors of dense stone laid down in the original construction and then built over and around as the palace expanded across centuries. The light down here was cooler and more indifferent, coming from fixtures replaced many times but maintaining the same quality of institutional practicality. They were 3 levels down when the corridor ahead changed. It happened without announcement. One moment the corridor was empty. The next it contained people, many people, moving from 3 directions simultaneously, filling the space with the precision of a formation that had rehearsed this specific geometry. They came through doors and down staircases and out of the service alcoves that lined both walls. 100 figures in golden armor that caught the corridor light and threw it back in fragments. The Valori Elite Guard. Kale had reviewed their records in the abstract context of military assessment. She had understood them intellectually. The training regimen, the selection criteria, the specific modifications that separated them from ordinary Valori warriors. Understanding them intellectually and standing in a stone corridor, watching them fill every available space were 2 categorically different experiences. They moved like a single organism, each element adjusting to the others with the unconscious coordination of something that had been trained past individual decision-making and into the territory of shared instinct. They surrounded her completely. Captain Vale stepped forward from the leading edge of the formation. He was a large man by Valori standards, broad, heavily built, wearing the insignia of his rank, with the ease of someone for whom authority had become a physical quality rather than a social one. His face beneath his helm was composed, professional, carrying the expression of someone performing an unpleasant function with the understanding that unpleasant functions are sometimes necessary. "Princess Kale Vordain," he said, with the formal precision of official language, "you are charged with conspiracy against the imperial succession. You will surrender and submit to imperial judgment. Compliance will be noted in the proceedings." Kale looked at the 100 warriors filling the corridor. She felt something in her chest that was not quite fear. Fear was too simple a name for it. It was the physical sensation of understanding that a situation has arrived at the point past which alternatives no longer exist. The place where the only remaining question is what kind of ending this will be. Then Harlow stepped forward. He moved to stand between Kale and Vale, and he did it with the same unhurried manner he brought to everything, hands empty at his sides, making no gesture that could be interpreted as threatening and no gesture that could be interpreted as submissive. "The princess is under my protection," he said quietly. The silence lasted a single beat. Then Captain Vale laughed. It was not a cruel laugh. It was the laugh of someone who has heard something genuinely absurd and cannot help responding to it. Several warriors behind him shared it, the sound moving through the formation like a small current. "One human," Vale said, "against 100 of the finest warriors in the Empire." There was professional respect in his voice, the soldier's acknowledgement of something futile but not without a certain dignity. "You have courage. I will record that." "Thank you," Harlow said. Vale raised his weapon. "Kill them both." The formation moved. What happened next was something that Kale would spend the rest of her life attempting to describe and never quite managing to. Not because the memory was unclear. It was extraordinarily clear, burned into her recall with the hyper-precision that extreme situations sometimes produce. Every detail preserved in a resolution that ordinary experience never achieves. The difficulty was that the language available to describe it was built for experiences that operated according to different rules. Harlow moved through the formation the way a current moves through a circuit, not fighting the structure, but completing it, finding the path of least resistance and following it to its necessary conclusion. He was inside the formation before any warrior had completed his initial advance. The first warrior died before his blade finished its arc. Harlow had moved inside his reach and found the specific point where two plates of armor met, and the junction was the weakest element, and he had applied something small and precise there, and the warrior fell and did not move again. The second died because Harlow used the momentum of the first warrior's fall as a vector, borrowing its direction and adding to it, arriving at the second warrior's position from an angle the warrior's training had not accounted for. He took their weapons. This was the element that Kale found most extraordinary to witness. Not the deaths, which were terrible, but the economy. He did not fight and then take weapons. He took weapons as part of the fighting, integrating the transition so completely that the acquisition of each new tool was inseparable from the action that preceded it. A blade came into his hand and cut 3 warriors in a single arc. A fallen rifle fired twice. The shots calculated for the positions of 2 warriors 10 meters apart in the corridor's confined space. An armored body was lifted and used as a barrier against the energy weapons trying to find a clean angle. Nothing was wasted, nothing was performed. Every action had a specific function and accomplished exactly that function and nothing else. The elite guard was not passive. They responded, adapted, reformed. The way a trained unit responds to contact, closing gaps, redirecting pressure, trying to find the angles that would let numbers do what numbers are supposed to do. They struck at him repeatedly and with genuine capability. Some of their blows landed. She saw blood on his face. She saw blood on his arms, dark against the gray of his clothing. She saw him absorb impacts that would have stopped most beings and continue, not as if the impacts were not real, but as if they were factors in a calculation that had already accounted for them. He moved through the formation like a principle of physics, moving through matter, like the thing that matter cannot refuse. 3 warriors broke and ran. They made it to the staircase at the corridor's far end. No one could fault them for this. The rest did not run. The rest met what they met, in the stone corridor of the lower palace, and the corridor was very quiet for a moment when it was over. Kale counted 97 bodies. She counted them because she did not know what else to do in the first moments after. She counted them because it gave her mind something specific to do while the larger processing caught up with her. She lost her place twice and had to start from different reference points. 97. Harlow was on one knee in the center of the corridor. She had never seen him on one knee before. In 6 months of constant proximity, she had never seen him in a position that suggested reduced capacity. He had been still, or he had been moving, and in neither state had there been any visible indication of limitation. The knee was a specific communication then. The wounds were serious, not fatal, she assessed, but serious in the immediate sense, requiring attention. He was breathing harder than she had ever heard him breathe. Then Captain Vale rose from the floor. He had gone down in the middle of the engagement. She had seen it, had thought it was over, but he had been playing dead, or had recovered, or some combination of both. He was wounded, clearly, his armor compromised, his movement uneven, but he was upright, and he was moving toward Harlow's unprotected back with the focused determination of a man who has one remaining objective and intends to complete it. Kale's mind was very clear in the moment that followed. Not the way it was usually clear, not the calculating, deliberate clarity of assessment and strategy, but a different kind. A kind that was faster and simpler and did not consult anything except the immediate fact of what was happening and what needed to happen next. She moved. There was a sword on the floor, One of the elite guard had dropped it when Harlow passed through him, and it had fallen in the specific position that would allow her to reach it in the 3 steps available to her. She picked it up in motion, which was harder than it looked and considerably less graceful than she would have preferred. She was not trained with a sword. She had been given the formal defensive protocols that Valori royalty received as a matter of course, and formal defensive protocol had not included practical swordsmanship because that was what bodyguards were for. She did not do anything elegant with the sword. She covered the remaining distance to Vale, and she drove the blade forward in the way that a person who has never done it before drives a blade forward, with too much of her whole body committed to the action, with the balance slightly wrong, with the angle not precisely calculated. It was enough. Vale stopped. He stood there for a moment in absolute stillness that had nothing in common with Harlow's stillness. This was not the stillness of something in control, but the stillness of something at the end of its motion. Then he went down. The sword was very heavy in her hands. She had not expected it to be so heavy. Harlow turned. He had heard her behind him. Her approach had been what it had been. And he turned from his knee, still bleeding, still breathing hard, and he looked at her. He looked at the sword in her hands. He looked at Vale on the floor. He looked at her face. Then he nodded. It was a single small movement, the kind of nod that does not require anything added to it, the kind that means exactly what it means and nothing less. She stood in the corridor with 97 bodies and the weight of the sword in that single nod, and she understood, not as information, not as assessed data, but in the way that things become permanently true, their recognition, that something had changed, not in him, in her. The woman who had been in this corridor 5 minutes ago and the woman who was in it now were connected by the same name and the same history, but they were not the same in the way that mattered. She had chosen, not been forced, not performed a reflex, chosen in the specific moment when she could have stayed behind and let the outcome be whatever the outcome was, to step forward instead. Remember how that felt, she remembered. Davin's support collapsed within 72 hours. Not all at once. These things never happen all at once. It happened the way things happen when the foundational calculation changes. First, the people at the margins, the ones whose commitment had always been contingent rather than genuine, who recalibrated instantly when the expected outcome revised itself. Then the middle layer, the ones who had been more committed, but who understood that commitment to a losing position was not loyalty, it was waste. By the time the formal announcement came that Davin had departed for the outer territories with a small personal retinue and no stated intention to return, there was no one left in the capital who publicly acknowledged having been particularly supportive of him to begin with. Seven was more careful, as she had always been more careful than her brother. She did not flee. She opened a communication channel to Rowan at the 3rd hour of the morning following the quarter, before the light had fully arrived, and she said the things that a person says when they have correctly assessed that their position has become untenable and wish to negotiate the terms of the new arrangement from whatever leverage remains available. Kale received her the following afternoon. The meeting was brief. Seven was not a small person in any sense, not physically, not in terms of the qualities that had made her dangerous for years. And she sat across from Kale with the specific dignity of someone who has lost and intends to do so without providing her opponent with the satisfaction of visible collapse. There was something to respect in this. Kale acknowledged it. You will retain your title, Kale said, your household and your properties, your position in court. She paused. What you will not retain is any network of independent security operations, any financial relationships with contractor organizations, or any communication with Devon or his remaining associates. Seven was quiet for a moment. And if I agree to these terms, then we begin the work of an empire that has several serious problems and not enough people willing to address them honestly. Seven looked at her with the assessing attention that had characterized her for as long as Kale could remember. Measuring, calculating, always finding the angle. Then something in her expression shifted, very slightly, in a way that was not capitulation but was perhaps something more durable. You are not what I expected you to be, she said. I know, Kale replied. Neither was I. The emperor died on a Sunday, 4 days after the quarter. He died quietly, in his chambers, with the physician present and a small number of household staff who had served him for many years. The official announcement was made at midday. The empire paused in the way that empires pause when the person who has been the structural center of a system for a long time is suddenly no longer present. Not with grief exactly, but with the particular adjustment of something recalibrating around a new center of gravity. The coronation was held on the following Wednesday. The Crystal Hall had been restored from the damage of the diplomatic dinner, the broken glass replaced, the stained floor cleaned, the lighting returned to its full complexity. Kale sat in it again as she had sat in it many times before, but she sat in a different chair, at a different position in the room, and the hall had been arranged around her this time, rather than away from her. Thousands of beings filled the space. Ambassadors from across the empire and beyond its formal borders, military commanders and noble families and diplomatic delegations from species that had not previously had occasion to attend Valori coronations. They were there for various reasons, as these gatherings always attracted various reasons. Some came out of genuine diplomatic interest. Some came because not coming would have communicated something they did not wish to communicate. Some came because they had heard the story of the corridor and they needed to see what it had produced. The story had grown, as stories do, in the telling. The corridor had become multiple corridors. 97 had become 150 in some versions, 200 in others. Some versions said Harlow had done it without bleeding at all. Some said he could not be killed, that he was something other than a living thing in the conventional sense. Some versions said he had moved through walls. Harlow stood behind the throne in the position of the royal bodyguard. He wore the same gray clothing he always wore. No armor, no visible weapons. The new scars on his face had joined the old ones, the way such things accumulate. Added to the record without erasing it, each one a specific notation in a long document. He stood still and watched the hall with the focused, steady attention that had been his from the beginning. The beings in the hall gave him room. Not obviously, they were too composed for obviousness, but consistently. The 10-meter radius that had developed around him since the story spread was maintained with the unconscious precision of people who are not aware they are maintaining it, who are simply not choosing to be where he was. The most decorated military commanders, the most formidable diplomatic representatives of species with substantial military capabilities. None of them within 10 meters of the man in gray. They called him many things. The warden, the still one, the end, death made patient. He had heard all of them and acknowledged none of them. The ceremony proceeded through its ancient forms, the words spoken in the old register of imperial language, the rituals performed in their prescribed sequence, the specific gestures of assumption made with the objects that had been used for this purpose across several hundred cycles of Valori rule. Kale performed each element with the composure of someone who had arrived at a threshold and stepped across it because the alternative was worse. When it was done, she was empress. Ambassador Audra Voss requested an audience that evening. Kale had expected her. She had been expecting her in some form for several weeks, had known that Earth's formal diplomatic representative would appear after the dust settled, that there would be a conversation, that the conversation would contain information she did not yet have. Voss was a woman in her late 50s, gray-haired, carrying herself with the unhurried assurance of someone who had been in rooms full of powerful people for long enough that the category no longer impressed her. She reminded Kale in several respects of Elder Rowan, not physically, but in the way of a person who had spent a long time watching things and had developed considerable clarity about what they were actually seeing. She also reminded her, in a way she could not immediately name, of Harlow. The audience took place in Kale's private study. Rowan was present. Harlow stood by the window. After the formal preliminary portion of the conversation, Voss moved into the substance of what she had come to say. Earth's position with respect to the Empire has historically been ambiguous, she said. We were contacted. We were invited to participate in certain imperial processes. We complied. We maintained what could be called a position of engaged neutrality. That position, Kale said, appears to have been somewhat more engaged than the neutrality framing suggested. Voss smiled. A small smile, the smile of someone who does not find being caught out particularly alarming because they had not expected not to be. Earth does not engage in accidents. When the opportunity of the tribute auction arose, we saw a specific opening. Tell me about the opening. The empire is powerful, Voss said. By virtually any conventional metric, it is more powerful than Earth. You have more ships, more territory, more accumulated military capability. A direct conflict would be devastating to us. She paused. It would also be devastating to you, perhaps more so. Humanity has a particular relationship to existential conflict. We have been in one before, against ourselves, and we learn things from it that are not in the public record of what we are as a species. Cale thought about Harlow's explanation in the first weeks, about persistence predators in the science of death and the generations of accumulated understanding about how things ended. You wanted to demonstrate something. We wanted to ensure there was no miscalculation about the cost of testing us. Powerful empires sometimes extend their assessment framework to species that do not fit it. They look at apparent fragility and make assumptions. We wanted to correct that assumption before it became a policy. Voss looked at Harlow. He is not our strongest soldier, Empress. He is not our best fighter, our most decorated warrior, the apex of our military capability. The room was very quiet. Then what is he? Cale asked. He is what happens when a human who has looked all the way into what we are decides to use that understanding in the service of something worth protecting. She paused. There are thousands like him, hundreds of thousands in varying degrees. We train them not because we want war, but because we have learned through painful historical experience that demonstrating the cost of starting one is the most reliable one to prevent it. Cale looked at Harlow. He had not moved during this conversation. He had not reacted to being described, had not shifted or looked away, or produced any of the small signals that most beings produce when they are the direct subject of discussion. He stood at the window and watched the room with the same dark, steady attention he had brought to every room he had ever occupied in her presence. He volunteered, Cale said. It was not quite a question. Voss looked at her carefully. Yes. Why? A pause. His briefing materials included a standard background package on the assignment, the political situation, the target principle, the relevant history. Another pause. There was a detail in that package, a small one. It had no direct operational relevance. Cale waited. 3 years before the auction, Voss said, you used a significant portion of your personal discretionary funds to purchase the freedom of 17 captured warriors, beings from a non-Valori species who had been taken in a border engagement and held as indentured military assets. The transaction was conducted through a series of intermediary accounts. It was never officially connected to you. There was no political benefit to you. If your siblings had known, there would have been a political cost. Voss met her eyes. You did it because it was the right thing to do. In a court where the right thing is rarely done, because it is rarely profitable, you did it quietly and correctly, and then you said nothing about it to anyone. The study was very still. Harlow read that, Cale said. He read it and he walked into the briefing officer's office and said he wanted the assignment. Voss paused. Not because it was militarily significant, not because it served some larger strategic purpose, because he read about a person who did a difficult right thing at personal cost with no expectation of return, and he decided that person deserved to survive. Cale sat with this for a moment. She thought about the 17 warriors. She thought about the 3 years during which that decision had sat in a record somewhere, unremarked, unconnected to her officially, apparently without consequence. She thought about the specific way that things you do in private, that you do without expecting return, have a way of traveling through the world in paths you cannot predict and arriving somewhere you never anticipated. He chose this, she said. He chose you, Voss said. There is a difference. Voss left without ceremony, the way she had arrived. After Rowan had excused himself and the study had settled into the quiet of a late evening, Cale sat alone with Harlow in the room where they had first talked after the Crystal Hall. He had not moved to leave. She had not asked him to. I need to ask you something, she said. I know. Was it real? The protection, the map, all of it. She paused. Was any of it something you actually chose, or was it the mission running the way you had designed it to run? Harlow was quiet for a long time, not the short quiet of someone collecting a thought, but the long quiet of someone giving a question the full weight it deserved. The mission, he said finally, was to place you on the throne. He paused. I completed the mission the night you picked up that sword. She waited. Everything I did before that was the mission and my own preference running in the same direction. I cannot cleanly separate them. He turned from the window to face her. In the low light of the evening study, he looked exactly as he had looked on the stage at Keth Prime. The same man, unchanged, not softened by the intervening months into something more legible. But the mission is finished. It was finished 6 hours ago in the Crystal Hall. And now? Now I stay because I choose to. Wei-san. Something moved in his face, not the quick flicker she had seen in the first weeks. Something slower, more deliberate. The look of a man who had considered something thoroughly and reached a conclusion and was willing to be seen in it. Because you are going to do difficult right things, he said. And difficult right things are easier when someone is standing next to you who is not afraid of what they cost. She reached out and took his hand. It was warm. Scarred across the knuckles and the palm, each mark a notation in a document she could read only partially, but warm. The hand of a human being, which was something she had not fully appreciated as a category until it was in her hand, and she understood now what it meant. Not as a descriptor, not as a classification, as a fact about what was present in the room with her. There is a great deal wrong with this empire, she said. Yes, it will take a long time to correct. It will. Masa, the people who benefited from what was wrong will not accept correction easily. No, his hand was still in hers. They never do. She looked out the window at the city below. Millions of lives, each one a variable in a system that was going to have to change, slowly and with difficulty and against resistance, into something that produced less suffering than the thing it was replacing. It was not a small task. In certain respects, it was a nearly impossible one. She had no illusions about that, but she was the person who had stood in a corridor and picked up a sword. She was the person who had seen the gap in a negotiation and stepped into it without a script. She was the person who had, 3 years ago, done a quiet right thing at personal cost with no expectation that it would ever matter to anyone but the 17 people it freed. She had not known until this evening that the act had traveled through the world and found its way back to her in the shape of a human man from Fort Bragg, North Carolina, who had read a single line in a background file and decided she was worth the trouble. Don't let go yet, she said. He didn't. 3 weeks after the coronation, Threnia Cauldron took her seat at the first meeting of the Imperial Commerce Council, the first such body in 400 years of Valori rule. She did not thank anyone. She simply opened her ledger and began the work, which was exactly what Kale had expected of her and exactly what the Empire needed. Seven retained her title and her household. She attended the first court session of the new reign and sat in her assigned seat without complaint. She brought, over the months that followed, an institutional knowledge of the noble houses that turned out to be genuinely useful. Kale had not anticipated this, and she acknowledged it directly when it became apparent, which surprised Seven more than anything else that had happened that year. Davin did not return from the outer territories. He sent, 6 weeks after his departure, a single formal communication acknowledging the new empress. It contained no apology and no explanation. Kale filed it and moved on. There was too much work for old grievances. Elder Rowan was appointed first counselor, a title he accepted with the expression of a man who had been doing the job for years without the official designation and found the formality mildly amusing. He wore the same gray robes to the appointment ceremony that he wore to everything else. He did not change his manner, his pace, or his approach to any of his responsibilities. This was, as Kale noted to him afterward, precisely why she had appointed him. Garrett Harlow was given no title. He had not asked for one. He stood behind the throne in the position of the royal bodyguard, as he had stood behind her chair at dinner and behind her in corridors and outside sealed doors for 7 months. He watched each room they entered. He noted each exit. He did the quiet, specific work of keeping someone worth keeping alive. One evening, 6 weeks into the new reign, Kale looked up from a document she had been reviewing for 2 hours and said, "You should sleep." 4 hours, I will. Tonight. A pause. Yes, Empress. She went back to the document. He stayed at the window watching the palace city go about the business of a city learning to be something different than it had always been, imperfectly, incrementally, with the particular stubbornness of things that are alive and intend to remain so. Humanity's gift to the galaxy was not its ferocity, not its capacity for destruction, not its thousand generations of accumulated understanding of how things ended. Those were real, and they were part of the truth. And Kale understood them now in a way she had not understood them on the day she made the cheapest bid at an auction on Keth Prime. But the gift, the actual gift, the thing that could not be manufactured or replicated or taken by force, was this, that the most dangerous thing in existence had looked at the world and decided that what it wanted to do with all that capability was stand between harm and the people worth protecting. That it had chosen every day, with full knowledge of what it was choosing and what the alternatives were, to be the thing at the gate rather than the thing that came through it. That it knew precisely, completely without illusion, what it was. And it had decided that what it was going to do with what it was this. The warden kept his watch. The work continued. And in the high rooms of a new empire, slowly and with difficulty and against resistance, and with the full knowledge of what it would cost, the better thing began.